Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 8th, 2022. Today I'm going to be speaking about the Pyrrhic victory achieved by Boris Johnson in defeating the vote of no confidence against him held by the Tory party earlier this week. The bad news for Johnson is that 40% of his party members voted against him. That is, they voted for no confidence in him. The typical headlines in the British press said things like, "Boris survived, but the end is near." So the question is, if this is a Pyrrhic victory, to what lengths might Johnson go to try to keep his position? Now, the issues behind the vote are many. The primary one was the accusation that he flaunted his own rules with so-called Partygate. That is, while he had ordered strict lockdowns for most people in the United Kingdom, he carried on parties with his own inner circle and then lied about it. And this became one of the leading issues, but not the only issue. There's the problem of the collapse of popularity for Johnson, in part from his economic policies, the inflation, which is driving living standards down and especially hitting middle-income and low-income families. There's also the Brexit issue, that he was unpopular with members of the Tory party who were opposed to Brexit, but also some supporters of Brexit who think he mishandled the negotiations. And then there's also the personal issue, his narcissism. The fact that many people consider him a buffoon and a showman. At a time when there are profound crises in the world, can they afford to have someone who's lurching from issue to issue, concerned more with his immediate popularity than with the future of the country? But let's keep in mind he was put in office in order to make sure that Brexit would be used as an opportunity to reshape the British Empire. That was his job when he became prime minister. The idea is that Britain would continue to be a co-leader with the United States in shaping the world order on behalf of the City of London and Wall Street interests, and that this would be a unipolar order dominated by Washington with backup from London and also Brussels. Now, that's what global Britain was meant to be, to ensure that Britain would maintain its spot at the top of the Anglo-American order. The government website of the United Kingdom defines global Britain this way. It says, "Global Britain is about reinvesting in our relationships, championing the rules-based order, and demonstrating that the UK is open, outward-looking, and confident on the world stage." Now, what the global Britain is a reorganization of the British Empire. And by rules-based order, what they really mean is the unipolar world. Now, what does this mean? This is the idea of the domination of world economy by neoliberal trade and economic policies, typified by subordination of national interests to the global interests of such institutions as the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization. That is, no sovereignty. Economic sovereignty is not allowed, because what instead must be adhered to is a supranational government which acts on the interests of the international or global corporate cartels. Then, if countries do not accept that is, if they try to break from this rules-based order, they're subjected to color revolutions and regime change, as well as wars. That if you step out of line with the unipolar order, you can be squashed. Look at Iraq, look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Yemen, look at the coup that took place in Ukraine in 2014. Now, a major role was played behind the global Britain by what was called the D10 Project. Now, this was something launched by the Atlantic Council, the Democratic 10. And the idea is to carry out an initiative that promotes a narrative that the world is now divided between democracies and autocratic governments. On the one hand, you have Britain, the United States, and the so-called Western democracies. On the other side, you have Russia, China, Iran, and so on, the autocratic regimes. And this was an alliance designed to maintain a rules-based order. They sponsored a summit for democracy on December 9th and 10th in 2021. Now think of the dates there. That was in the midst of the campaign by President Putin to win support for his proposal for security guarantees for Russia. That is, Putin for more than a decade and a half had been insisting that NATO had been infringing on Russia's security guarantees, and that he had run out of patience, especially over the war that was being conducted against the Donbas region by Ukrainian forces, particularly by Ukrainian forces led by Nazis of the Azov regiment. And so it was in that period in December where we had several discussions with Biden, where they handed a draft treaty that would have called for no NATO membership for Ukraine, denazification, and no offensive weapons to Ukraine. But this was rejected by the United States and the West, which preceded the special military operations launched on February 24th. Now, the question is, what is Boris Johnson's role going forward? How will he guarantee his survival? And what he's trying to do is channel Churchill and Thatcher to present himself as a wartime leader in the image of Churchill and Thatcher. And he's doing this in particular with the embrace of Zelensky and the so-called Ukrainian cause. Now, after he survived the no confidence vote, Zelensky told the Financial Times he was, quote, very happy, unquote. He's glad Boris won. I'm glad we haven't lost an important ally. This is great news. Now, Zelensky has played a major role in Boris's efforts to show himself as a Churchill-type figure, including his stroll through the streets of Kiev in April, side by side with Zelensky, the media figure Zelensky. In May, he became the first foreign leader since the special military operations to speak before Ukraine's parliament. And in it, he adopted Churchillian rhetoric. He said to the delegates, "You have exploded the myth of Putin's invincibility, and you have written one of the most glorious chapters in military history and in the life of your country. The so-called irresistible force of Putin's war machine," he said, "has broken on the immovable object of Ukrainian patriotism and love of country." And he went on, again in a Churchillian spirit, praising the brave Ukrainian resistance as your country's, quote, finest hour, unquote, one that, quote, will be remembered and recounted for generations to come. And so he's staking his future to his role with Ukraine. Now, at the same time, he's just announced that he will be sending multiple launch rocket systems to Ukraine, joining the United States to providing weapons that could be long range and could reach into Russia if they're moved into eastern Ukraine. Now, Thatcher is the other side of this. The 40th anniversary of the great victory of the British military over Argentina in the Falklands War, that's the British name for it. Argentina surrendered June 14th, 1982. The Argentine military had recaptured these islands, which are the Malvinas Islands, and Thatcher sent a British armada 8,000 miles to retake the islands in what was considered a great military victory for the British. Johnson recently had a meeting with veterans from that war, and he praised them for demonstrating that, quote, Britain was prepared then to stand up for what is right, unquote. And by implication, that's what he's doing in the image of Thatcher. Now, what's the important thing about Churchill and Thatcher? They were both operatives on behalf of the British Empire, specifically the City of London financial interests and the landed interests of the oligarchy that centered in the City of London. Churchill was a racist, an arch-imperialist, who never gave that up. And at the end of World War II, which partly happened as a result of mistakes and blunders made by leaders of Great Britain, Churchill, after World War II, became one of the architects of the Cold War through his manipulation of the pathetic President of the United States, Harry Truman. Thatcher followed the Falklands victory with the Big Bang, that is, the full deregulation of the British economy, privatization, deregulation of banking, which unleashed the neoliberal speculative binge that has taken us today to the collapse of the system. So as the empire of Churchill and Thatcher is collapsing, the no confidence vote may indicate that there are many people in the British hierarchy who don't think that Boris Johnson is up to the job of protecting and preserving the power of the British Empire. That's my report for today. I'll see you again tomorrow.